Hi everyone, welcome to DocuSpace episode 6. It's not a catch-all term. I'll be your host, Ravi.
And I'm Joseph. We'll let our good friends Alex and Jack give their intros. We're excited to have Jack back. Alex is a new face, sort of. Right. So we'll start with Alex. Tell us a little bit about yourself, I guess.
Yeah, so my name is Alexandria. A little bit about me. I used to study architecture. That's how Joseph, Ruby, and I met through Cornell. And Jack and I met through a professor that we both had when I was in the Architecture Association in London. And I've been on a journey since London, being there and working on, getting my bachelor's. Into community building and design and integrating more in real estate, where I see a lot of like orchestration that happens to make projects come to life and bring them to reality. And a big part of this journey for me after school is now tying these two worlds of like asset management, which is what I'm into now, community building, design, and yeah, those kinds of things. So excited to talk about this today.
So yeah.
Look at that.
And
She said community 4 times already. And this episode is
Boom.
about community. Unless I miscounted, which
What
would
are
be
the chances? What are the chances?
awesome. Yeah. And of course, hopefully by now people will recognize Jack, but Jack, just a little background from you as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Jack. I'm an architect working in London, but I've worked relatively frequently with Alex and Joseph and Rabi on relative community, buzzword community projects, hopefully worldwide, and hoping to reach out further.
Awesome. Yeah. Great. So yeah, this is I guess we're expanding the community of this podcast a little bit more with a new face now. I think everybody has made an appearance now with Alex. So
yeah, that's
this
all
is
of us.
you've seen all the faces. Yeah, and so we'll get right into the conversation. So as we kind of alluded to today, we'll be talking about community. I think it's cool that we mentioned the word buzzword because kind of going into this, we're talking about like what really all these words that are attached to community mean. And I think part of that is like it is like, we are humans, with social animals, and I think it's something that we all hear a lot. And it is something that everybody needs. And so it is also sold to us in some ways, right? Like there is like a lot of companies that will make a huge deal of like, oh, we're gonna have the CEO today go down the street in this place and talk to this mom, right? This idea of like we're connecting to you, right? And it's something that's sold to us all the time. But again, it is a basic human need. So that's kind of like this I think dichotomy of like, this is something we all need, but it's also something that is sold to us or is used to get us to buy into things.
Yeah, I think that happened to me with New York, actually. Even my job, where there's these words that people throw around, inclusivity, diversity, and I'm like, okay, yes, I'll buy into them, but I actually go into a place and I'm like, oh, what happened? Where
is it?
Is it in the room with us? Someone would say.
Is diversity in the room with us right
now? Is it me? Am I diverse?
Like, am I the one?
Honestly, depending on the setting, you might be. Like, that is a thing where it's like there's like the diversity hire or something like that.
Yeah, no, that exists, and I'm happy to be it because it's giving me a job opportunity.
I love that.
Are you sure?
No, Jack. You ask me real questions, and I cannot.
Jack is like the armchair psychologist. Like, are you sure about that? Is that what you really believe?
No, in the previous episode, I was talking about how like I at least got paid for my hard work, and then he was like, "Are you really?"
The mental games we play, yeah.
This is the space. This is the space.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think another question we should address is just like what personally defines a community for us, and then what does the lack thereof look like. Personally, for me, a community is people I can connect with, not just on a surface level. It's not just asking about the weather, but people I can actually connect with, and people I can disagree with as well, and then still come back to those people no matter what, and do my part in it. So it's just a very multi-layered thing for me. And as much as I hate it when my mom says humans are social animals, as I'm growing old, I'm realizing that yes, there is so much more opportunity to learn and grow if you connect with other people and do it, because every single other person you're going to meet is going to teach you something at the end of the day. Also, the lack thereof can look really isolating and can be very scary. Like, yes, I can retreat to a cabin in the wood. No, really, I can't monetarily, but that could be.
Nice pipe dream.
But it can be very isolating. It can be very lonely. I think it's also something we all must have gone through in one way or another. So when I moved from Pakistan to here is where there was a gap where I was looking for community. Same for Joseph, maybe when he moved.
Yeah, when I moved from Pakistan here too, I was looking for community.
No, when you move from Ithaca to Charlotte.
Yes, yes.
Or
yes.
Alex has constantly been moving around, or even Jack, when you move from like a small town to a bigger one, like how did we kind of carve our space for ourselves? And it takes time. And
Yeah,
in
it
the
does,
time,
yeah.
it can feel isolating. And sometimes you're a part of the community and you can still feel isolated because maybe it's just not as deeply layered as it's meant to be.
Yeah.
Or it's like, you know, presented to you a certain way, but you're still, there's no action related to it.
What do you think stops you from connecting within a community? So, for example, if there isn't a community that exists, right? And you feel like you're having a hard time connecting, what do you feel is like the foundation of that? Like, what are things that you feel?
Yeah, that's a really good one, because I think ironically, like coming to Charlotte has been a little harder than coming from Ghana to America in a weird way. Because when we moved here, we moved to Worcester, and Worcester has like a ton of Ghanaian people there, right? So I think to some extent there is that like superficial layer to the community, right? Like you can connect to someone purely based from, you know, you're from the same place, you're the same background, maybe you have the same ideas, maybe like the same music, right? There's like that superficial layer that kind of like makes it easy to at least like broach into it. I think like moving to Charlotte, the best I could do was like find other new graduates, but that was hard to do. And a lot of people here, especially like come from like very different backgrounds that aren't super, I guess, easy for me to understand. Like there's a lot of banking here, like Bank of America's capital is here. So there's a lot of finance people. Remember, I joined some meetups. There's this app called Meetup that you can join. And I was like, oh, expats and whatever. So I went to some meetups and, you know, it's like, oh, what work do you do? And then they talk about like something finance, blah, blah, blah. And I just kind of like was zoned out a little bit. And at some point I was like, you know, I'm not going to force this to happen. If it happens organically, it does. And it has happened, right? Like I wouldn't say my community is really big. I know like maybe 3 people in Charlotte that like I really connect to. But that was really hard to discover, and it really happened by chance. Like maybe I met them at work, or like I met them at the grocery store, or I saw them a lot when I was going to work or something like that, right? Like, but yeah, I think like that gateway.
Or that
sometimes
guy you were running
yeah.
after for a flyer, also.
Okay, I'll tell that story later. But I think
Yeah, we'll
to
tell
me,
that story later. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. Like, but I guess for what I'm trying to say is like to me, like the superficial layer is important because it makes it easy to take that first step. And if it's not there, then it's like, you know, yeah.
I think all connections begin superficially, though.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
That's true, but there it's interesting that you say that too, Jack. Sorry, Joseph. I thought, Jack, are you going to say something? I don't want to interrupt.
No, you go.
Okay. Yes, like you mentioned how, you know, when you went to like these like meetups and you were trying to talk to people, sometimes there's just like an instant click with people, even though you may not have any connection with background or like being finance or anything like that. Like when I came to San Diego, I basically also did the same thing. And I met one person, she's a software engineer, completely different life paths. But where we bonded was things related to like family or past experiences or things in regards to like emotional growth and experiences that we want to have. And it's not necessarily like a superficial layer. Like we managed to get into these things within like 3 hours of us, like our first conversation. And I think that's also interesting, right? Like how sometimes you can just click, right, with certain people. And I wonder if it has to do with place, time, right? That where you are meeting the person, are you meeting like doing something like a similar hobby or activity? Or are you just going on an app, right? A literal app where you're meeting friends and it's a way to like connect with other people who are also looking to have like deeper connections. So I know that was something that we had talked about before this conversation, about how there's different mediums of creating community too. And who knows, maybe for some people certain mediums work better, and that's super interesting too.
Well,
Yeah.
to add to that, I think I've made a lot of online friends over the years, and this is difficult to talk about because my dad's gonna be watching this. I'm sorry, Dad.
So scandalous. Online friends.
So scandalous.
Like
But,
that doesn't
like,
count.
No.
growing up in Pakistan, and as a woman, right, I was not given as much interface with the outside. So a way that I connected with people was just online. And when I love things deeply. That means that's just my way of saying that I was a fangirl. I watched a lot of anime, then I would join anime groups, talk to people within those groups. And then, I got into Marvel for a little bit, joined Marvel groups, talk to people within the groups. So there's like communities that create around shared interest. And I think there's more and more of that now, like these virtual communities that exist. Like, I know there's this author I really like, Rachel Smythe. She does the Lore Olympus webtoon, and she has a Discord channel, and she pops in and we do Q&As, and is the most wonderful way. Whereas I remember like a few years ago, you would have to go to a Comic-Con to have that kind of experience. So I think that's something that's really cool. Or to answer your earlier question also, like, what is the barrier that there is to finding a community? I feel like a lot of the times it's just that we don't make enough of an effort to go and look for it. And to tell a story, there was this period that I was in New York for a little bit, and I felt really isolated. And it was during a time where I was about to take a semester break. So I was about to leave, and I just left school. So there was this time in between where I didn't really connect with people. And there's this Facebook group that I joined for just like brown women who support each other. And I just texted there. I was like, hey, does anyone want to see a movie with me? And then this girl responded, and she was like, not a movie, but do you want to get dessert? And I went out, and it was just like one of those things. This girl lives in Texas, was just visiting New York City, and we just went to a dessert place and we talked. And then now we just talk, like we're just friends now. And it was just such a beautiful experience where I'm like, oh, okay, this can happen. Like, I can go out, I can meet a person, I can have a genuine connection with them. I just need to try.
Yeah. And I think, Alex, something that you mentioned about like the space aspect of it. I remember like looking at, when I was in school, we did this studio project in Barcelona, and part of it was like looking at the bigger ground map of Barcelona, and it's all courtyard houses, like primarily. And in Ghana too, like the main typology is courtyard houses. And in the States, that, at least to my knowledge, I don't really see that very often. Right, like a typology that's about like gathering people and then having a very intimate, I guess like intimate space to disconnect and chat and hang out. And like looking at New York, I remember when I looked at the bigger ground for New York, like the courtyard is like Central Square. It's like all these black squares and then like this one main space, but it's not an intimate space or anything like that. And to the conversation about like buzzwords, like I think when you look at the built environment in that way, like it does give you cues as to like how people are supposed to relate to one another, right? Like, is there space intentionally made for that to happen, or is it more of like an act of resistance? Like, and another example that was pretty cool was like when we were studying abroad in Rome. Robbie and I were actually working together on Palazzo Farnese. It's like this building that is now like, correct me if I'm wrong, Robbie, it's like an embassy building or something like that.
Yeah, it's the French consulate.
The French consulate, yeah. And so Palazzo Farnese is like, it was built in such a way that like the facade of the building is like furniture, right? You're supposed to be able to sit on it. And historically, looking back at the building's history, this was a space like where like community would gather, and there'd be like meetings and public like conversation, and like there'd be like a town hall
built for the Pope. The Pope lived on the second floor.
Yeah, so like there was like, it was intentionally made with the idea that people are supposed to come here, and now it's the consulate and it's gated off. You can't even sit there. Like us standing in front of it taking photos was like an act of hostility a little bit, because like the guards came to us, they're like, what are you doing here, right? And these examples like happen across many spaces, right? I think in the States, an easy one that people talk about a lot is like anti-homeless furniture in parks, right? Like it's like a park is like a space of gathering and comfort, but then there's things that are making it so you can't do that, right? Like even park furniture that has like those anti-skater rails, right? Like so skateboarders are not invited here. There's these things that we're doing that like are actively against creating the spaces for people to like just naturally meet each other or like just exist publicly, right? Like, and I think that that's another aspect of it to some degree, right? Like, is there an intention of creating the space, the physical space for it? I think digitally it's really easy and it's a lot more varied, right? You can be talking to someone in Brazil pretty easily digitally, but like I think the physical aspect of it is something that is lagging behind all these digital
Right.
progressions, I
Yeah.
guess.
And easily said, like all of these things are physically lagging behind.
Yeah.
Like we say we support community, we say we support like development in community, but actually achieving something like what you're saying always has like a time lag. Like every time we say that we're developing something new, we're actually always recompensating for something that's already been lost or
Yeah.
hasn't been there and is being reconstituted. And that's usually like a big political issue in the redevelopment.
So true. It's also like I think sometimes with certain spaces, like what Rebbe alluded to, I did travel a lot over time and I've been to different cities and I've always felt like, oh man, like I'm not sure if this is the place, where I see myself potentially long term or to like settle roots into, because I've always wanted that feeling of like community, right, in a place, and to like be inspired to do different types of things. And it's so interesting because I think sometimes there's certain cities or environments, the way that the spaces are created, it feels almost daunting, right? Like you almost have to peel yourself out of your house, like, maybe
Yeah.
you have to take this train, and if you go home late, like who you're gonna go back home with because you don't want to be in the dark alone, or
Yeah.
like there's all these little things, like these micro potential worries, or it could be anxieties, or just like moments where there's a bit of a discomfort, right? To put yourself out there. And I would say San Diego is the first place that I've lived in that I just felt so inspired to go out and try new things and have different types of experiences and just constantly being surprised by what's out there. An opportunity to be able to meet other people and to share those kind of experiences with them too. And it's almost like you can have two different mediums to kind of get you to your sweet spot. Like the digital can get you to meet people, and then if the space is inspiring or the city that you're in, then that can grow also your network, right? Like you meet with them in person, and let's say you do something really fun that inspires both of you, and then you do another activity and you meet someone else through that, and it kind of grows, right, with time. But that is an interesting thought too about how these spaces, do they inspire us enough? Do they feel daunting? Like sometimes New York City can feel daunting for a lot of people. So I can see where that comes from, Rebbe.
I think to add to that conversation, I feel, well, we're talking about community as people. And when it comes to New York City, I love that you love San Diego, but also then are we designing cities to be intentionally isolating, right? Is a question that we need to ask ourselves. Like, why do urban spaces don't feel like urban spaces? They don't feel like spaces we can be comfortable in. Why do I not want to leave my house and go out and explore New York City, right? I don't know who I was speaking this with, but there's like certain things are designed to be exclusive, which is also another layer to the topic about creating communities. Like why, and then why are people then attracted to certain kind of exclusivity? Because then exclusivity also means that you're gating something. So then there's certain buildings that developers design to be exclusive, and what does that mean? And then is that contributing to me not wanting to leave my house because I don't feel welcomed in that space? And is this whole big city then becoming that thing? And this is me talking very generally, but I hope I'm getting my point across. Like,
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think Alex alluded to this a little bit, right? There's like this idea of like, we're gonna, and back to like, we're gonna take this from you and then sell it back to you. And this is happening across a lot of things, right? Like, I think human connection, especially the idea that we're gonna make it hard for you to have this, but then we're going to resell it to you slightly, like, oh, it's an exclusive club. It's a gated community. It's safe, right? There's an HOA. Like, like why do we need to do all these steps to get to a space where we can actually feel connected to our neighbor? Right? Like, does your neighbor need to reflect to you for you to connect with them? I think part of that physical culture that I can point to is like this obsession with like single family housing in the States. Like everybody needs to have their own home in, rows and then nothing around you. And we drive to the city and like that's like and it eats up a lot of space too. But I can think of like because my family doesn't own our own house or anything, but like in like my really close friend has a house that I go visit her all the time. And I remember once I was talking to her, I was like, so who's that neighbor? And they're like, yeah, we see them, we say hi, but I don't really know them. I'm like, do you know that neighbor? No, I don't know that neighbor either. And it's like, I've never even seen that
Yeah.
neighbor. Does someone live there? I don't know. Right. Like, I think that's like so easy to happen because of the nature of the single family typology. I'm not saying it can't happen, but like it doesn't opportune itself to that, right? Like I think in a weird way, we're building in a way that is forcing people to take all these extra steps. It's like, it's like you're going against the grain. To go to your neighbor is me walking onto their lawn, going to their door and knocking on it, not seeming intrusive, or like this idea of like minding your business, right? Like this idea of like the fence is here, this is my land, this is your land. We stay separate and we respect each other. And I think that's, good in some ways, but again, it's not going to be conducive to creating community or like creating the idea of like safety to even approach someone.
Right.
Yeah, it's not what you imagine when you think community.
Yeah.
It's when you think community, you think like a commonality, that's something that you have like in common with the person that you're sharing that space with. And I think it's like it's all too common that we don't even have that space that we are sharing. Like there is no shared space. There is no, we're going from the first space, which is where we are living, to the second space where we are working, and there's no third. Where do you fit that into that equation?
Oh, that's great. The commons.
That's
the
too
question of where the
dark.
commons is.
I mean, it's also like the older we get, and now that you're bringing up the single family home thing, I feel like the harder it is to build your community. I feel like people actually, it gets smaller and smaller, the groups that they hang out with. Like they start, like some people just spend time with their partner or their, most immediate
Or their
family.
dog or their cat.
Or their dog or cat, right? And we sort of lose touch with that almost with time. And because I think now, and this ties in with like that third space that you're mentioning, Jack. I have been trying to but organically, I've been in spaces where I'm meeting people who also really value like building a sense of community for others, right, through experiences and design. And this is one group. It's actually a brand. It's very interesting. It's called The Future is Color. And they had this event where everyone, it's just a group of people, no one knows each other. They come together and they call it studio
I think I heard
sessions.
yeah.
Yeah, and they listen to music together, and then they discuss like a set of themes that's related to that music, like contextually what was happening politically, socially, maybe even environmentally at that time. And they tie back into conversations with the people who are sitting there listening to the music. And everyone just dives into these extremely deep conversations. And there's so much bonding that happens there. Like people really open up because it feels like such a safe space. It doesn't feel superficial or artificial. And it's just amazing it even allowed me to say my own story and things that I've experienced. And everyone bonded in a really like fascinating way. And it's such a specific and niche kind of experience, like people coming together to listen to music. And someone orchestrated that. They curated this. And when I had mentioned in one of the conversations, because they had talked about, have you ever felt that you've changed your identity towards an expectation or something in life? And I had mentioned something in regards to, you know, architecture and of course some of the conversations that we've had about the industry. And the person who started this, he studied architecture and he described what he's doing as placemaking, which blew my mind. I was like, this is literally what even all of us have been talking about. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, there's other people who think like this and who desire and have this kind of passion for building a sense of community. And there were grown adults in this, right? Like it wasn't just, you know, people in their early 20s. It was so diverse. I mean, it was beautiful. It was beautiful to see that many people coming together and having just very vulnerable conversations, and everyone started talking afterwards, and we all made connections between each other. And yeah, it's
such a precious experience. Like my heart is full just listening to it. Oh my
yeah. Yeah.
You know, my question too is like, I think in school we talked about this, but it's like, can we design that to happen? Or
yeah,
is that
exactly.
something that only like
Yeah.
I'm not saying like one or the other, but like I know like the instances that I've had the courage to like talk to a stranger. Usually it's like when I'm taking the train and they're literally sitting across from me and I'm looking at them.
Mhm.
Do that.
It's like you have to say something at that point.
Yeah, like I had this conversation with this Cameroonian man, and he's like, "Oh, are you Ghanaian?" I was like, "Oh, how'd you know?" And I'm not gonna repeat what he said, but he had his own list of criteria, and I was like, "Okay, that's cool." And we spoke with the entire train ride, and I'm like, if I was sitting like adjacent to him, I'm not sure if I would have spoken to him, right? Like, I think, you know, that's maybe a very rudimentary example, but like, is there a way we can actually design that interaction to happen? Because I think right now, like, I guess the point we're kind of harping on a little bit is like the built environment isn't telling you to do this, but then people are finding ways to do it, right? Like people are organizing it. There's apps, there's group me's or meetups, right? Like, is there something that like, I guess, how does that look like physically for us? Or do we
Yeah.
know how, you know, we can maybe carve those spaces?
The good part is that people are going out there and actually doing this themselves. I think that's a positive thing that we're leaning towards. But as designers, yes, how do I do that? How do I create a space? Because, you know, it's our discussion is about community, and then what the placemaking that you just talked about is community-centric design. So how are we as designers integrating that? I don't have an answer to that question.
I think for me, one idea that I had immediately is like, I think a private project, the idea of a private project needs to have the common thing. Like, I think every private project needs to give something back. I guess I'm trying to say, like, you can build your building, but something about your building has to give back to the community in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's like you're creating a small garden in the front that invites, you know, like I think you have to be part of the city. You can't be a monolith that sits there. I think there's too much of that going on, where it's like you're walking and walking and walking, and there isn't that third space that can become available to you, right? Like, I think that's the power of the courtyard typology. Like when I lived in Ghana and we lived in a courtyard, there are people that were in that courtyard all the time that don't live there. Like all the time, right? It's someone's aunt or like the person that's like sells bread usually will come chill and play like a board game. And that was his space to come on his way from work, right? Like it was very easy for those things to happen because even though he doesn't live in that building, there was that aspect of it where you invited in. Like it wasn't even gated. It's like the courtyard was basically like, this is it. And then there's like that end open here and that end open here. And you can kind of walk through the courtyard to like get to the other side of the street. So people would do that constantly. And you know, through that nature of that setup, you would meet people all the time, or people would just sit and talk about whatever they spoke about. And I guess for me, like I think that is something that probably becomes like a regulatory thing. But you know, maybe the client might not want to do that. But I think as the architect, we should probably start advocating more for that, where it's like, yeah, your building should not be allowed to just serve only your interests because you exist in the world, and you should somehow give back in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. There's good and bad ways to do that, right?
Yeah,
Like,
for sure. Yeah.
there's this similar space to what you were talking about. I think it's along Lexington Avenue around between 60th and 30th, 60th and 50th Street. And I pass by that. It's like this huge gap between two streets. And it's a perfect opportunity to put some benches there and to sit and eat or do anything, but there's nothing I can place myself on. Like it's intentionally designed for people to not stay there, to just pass by. And that's such a shame. Whereas there's this courtyard around Grand Central. I'm so bad with directions. I can be more specific, but I'm just bad. I can go there. Like I walk 10 blocks to actually go sit there and eat because it's also, again, it's a courtyard, but it's so inviting. There's fountains that I can sit around just to eat. And that's wonderful. So why is the other space designed that way? And why is this space designed that way? And why are they not doing a better job? Too many.
Yeah. Another question is like, do you think that creates the excuse for nobody else to do it? Like, this is the park. If you want to do park stuff, go to this park. And then nobody else has to do anything to invite anything else.
Yeah. Also, I love third space. I love that you said that, Jack. I feel like maybe that should have been the name of this podcast. Like, why are you
Third
why are you
space.
just like literally?
Oh, okay.
I know.
Jack, you better
That's the
copyright
thing,
that.
like,
We're on
where
your
have I even
tail.
heard that? Like, where have I even heard that before? Because
Yeah,
it's,
I've heard that
it feels
too.
like for an
I don't know where.
architect, it is so like connected to community design, and whether you have it or not is like third space is like, it's not your home, it's not your workplace.
Yeah.
It's the other. Like that is what we're trying to provide, and it's above and beyond what like we're usually used to providing. But it means so many different things. Like it can be, I mean, it should be somewhere where you're not inclined to spend money. That's
Yes.
I think,
Yeah,
very
that's the
integral to-
commodification of it, I think. Or the third spaces we have are like the bar, the restaurant, places you go to spend money. Yeah.
Yeah. But ideally not. Ideally, it's somewhere you go without any strings attached.
Mhm.
And I think that's becoming more and more precious.
And I feel like the more specific those spaces are, just they become like, for example, like, yeah, right. Like if that third space is just people coming together, listening to music and the communities that people build through that, that was a designed experience. Or if it's like an open jazz event for people and then they just temporarily create a setup, right, in a space that maybe is usually abandoned or there's not really much activity there. I think being able to collaborate as like in that space of designers with other creatives or even people who are in other industries, right, but they're volunteering, like they can bring so much insight into how do you create a sense of community in these kinds of environments, right? Because part of it, yes, it's designed and it's a catalyst, but then there are all these other voices that need to also feel like they desire this thing or that they're drawn to it. So it's kind of a push and pull between those two things.
And I think a huge thing too is access, because
Mhm.
there is this epidemic of like real loneliness for people in cities. And I think in some countries it's a little bit more documented, right? Like I know in Japan they have things like the shut-in, but I remember Ruby and I were talking about this. We're like, there's no way this isn't something that exists in the States as well. It just not spoken about as much or it's documented, or because of the scale of the country, it's really hard to pinpoint this. But like if you go on social media, you can find instances of people like sharing this like cry for help of like, I haven't been touched by a person in years, like a hug, a handshake. I haven't done that in years. Right. And you can think like, yeah, you live in a city like New York or like San Francisco or wherever, right? Like a place where there's people all around you, and yet you can't access that. Like I guess my question too is like, how is this happening, right? Is it because of the reliance on the virtual, right? Like I think the virtual is good, but the physical aspect of it, right? Like the touch or like the hug or the, hand on the shoulder, like those things are equally important. And the question of like the virtual versus the real is becoming more and more a thing, right? Like we look at like metaverse where it's like, why ever go outside when you can put the goggles on and everything fantastical is happening there, right? Like, is that like a good substitute? Is that something that we can really advocate for? But then again, that's also something that's behind the paywall wall, right? Like it's not everybody can access that. Not everybody can buy the Google or the Apple Vision thingy, right? Like that's not an accessible thing. And it's behind, another access wall where depending on your resources, you won't ever, touch that. yeah, so I guess like access is also like a huge question of it for me, because
I
if
mean,
it's there, how do you get to it? Yeah.
have we, as a community worldwide, have we ever actually been begging for that? Like, has there ever been a movement where we've been like, we don't have enough of this? Like, actually, community is much more on a personal level than and a physical level than it has ever been on, I mean, over the internet or over a podcast or over any other sort of
Yeah.
media. Has it ever been as in demand as since we realized that we lost it?
Yeah.
I think we realized we needed it more than ever when we lost it.
Do
How
we
did you
feel
get it
like we
there?
ever had it? Do we feel like we've ever had it? Like,
Yeah.
what are
Yeah.
instances of true community that you feel like, wow, that is community? Like, what do
Off the top of my head, my documentary film class, really.
Mm.
Yeah.
I remember, or even my sculpture class, and I hate to say never my architecture classes, as much as I love the people who I was surrounded with, but I remember working really late in the documentary class multiple times. We had a studio space in the bottom of Schwartz, and we just had such a wonderful time. We would look at each other's work, we would critique each other's work, we would talk about stupid stuff, watch stupid stuff together. And it was just such an intimate time that if I could go back to it, I really would. Same with sculpture class, but with sculpture class, I was usually working alone and I loved it. But I think doc class was more like me with people and developing that connection. And then the question is also, why did I not have that with architects? Like, what is, I don't want to say wrong with our community, but what is so gated about it that I felt like an outsider, although I was in it, right?
Yeah.
And I think Joseph and I have talked about this, that it's about access again, right? Like, why is it hard for me to talk to certain architecture professors, but it's so easy for me to talk to professors from other classes? Like, why are architects making themselves inaccessible in that way? Or is this just in my head, or have you guys experienced this as well? Like, there's this whole, I mean, starchitects are so hard to reach, but they're starchitects. And I'm like, I think what you need to do is cater to people in communities, not become unreachable in that way. But I know I'm throwing out multiple things out there. But have you guys really experienced this within the architecture community where you're like, oh, this is not okay, or oh, this should be more accessible, or like, why did I start school and within the first week I met someone, they're like, oh, I'm never gonna see you again. You're always gonna be in Milstein, which is architecture.
That is interesting because I think the culture, I definitely see what you're saying, Robbie, because I definitely felt it too. And when I think where that changed for me was when I went to the Architectural Association in London. It was completely different, the culture with at least the class that I had. People were, it felt more like it was possible for everyone to be great in a way. Like, it didn't feel like there was only one, right? There was only one that could be the one that was great in the class, or like the rewards, right? Like they would
Oh
uh
yeah.
the awards that they
The
would
pecking
have.
order, really.
Yeah, exactly. But it felt very supportive. Like, people we were there for each other. We wanted to give, feedback that would push people into making the best project that was suited for them. Like, it felt like you were getting closer to your truth of architecture and how you express that, and how do we help you do that in the best way, right? Not that, oh no, there's only one standard and you have to fit into that, like the way that you draw or your line weights, or the graphics, or maybe even philosophy sometimes. So I think it was very interesting to see that how professors were also adapting to their students, and I love to see that. Like, they weren't necessarily just trying to push their own agenda, but they were asking questions like, what do you want this project to be? Or what are you drawn to most from what you're seeing that you're developing so far? And that's why we love Ricardo, right, Jack? Like, Ricardo was our professor. I mean, different schools. He was in the Bartlett and I was in the AA. And yeah, I also felt like that, a really strong sense of community there. But it was a very different culture from what existed, you know, from what it felt like in Cornell, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it really stands out. It stands out when you're made to think about these things and you're put on the spot and said, like, what is connecting with you with this context, and you're given a place. It's part of like architectural training, definitely in the UK, but probably further, that context is a very important aspect. And if you don't respond to that, then you're not responding to the brief. Like, so it's like fundamental. And I think that kind of ties into one of our earlier podcasts. That's what's the context. Like,
yeah.
If we don't have a context, then what are we talking about? Like, what are we responding to? And therefore, like, who's our audience? It's really important to like all the big questions on architecture.
Yeah. And something that was interesting that Ruby and I were talking about too is like within architecture, right? Like there's the bubble of architecture, but then it fits into all these other things. Sometimes it feels like the bridge is not there in the first place for you to even cross into the other field. Like we're talking about like we design buildings, we don't build them. Like the electrical engineer, the structural engineer, they might design it, but they don't ever build it, right? Like the people that build it, we barely have any connection with sometimes, right? Like the construction workers, and even the contractor, the construction worker, that's also like another relationship that like kind of separates us further from all these other aspects of it. And it was interesting because like talking to construction workers, like the very few that have gotten to or been able to, like there is this idea of like we tell you what to do and you do it, and it's not really a conversation of like, okay, what do you think is the best way to do it, right? Like how does it actually make sense for you, the one who's doing it, to do it as well? And I guess like that's kind of like the I guess the structure of architecture sometimes, right? Like there's this idea of like the architect has this role that supersedes everything else sometimes. And so there isn't an equal respect for other people to share that space. And again, this isn't a blanket statement, but I think like generally that's what tends to be felt. And even like in like, you know, within the office, right? Like if you're talking to your electrical engineer or your structural engineer, right? Like how do you connect to those people? Like, are they like invited to that same table to have that same conversation? Or is there certain conversations that are reserved for certain people to have? Like, I guess that's like the in and out type of thing of architecture, or it's like it's so exclusive in that way, right? Like, and Robbie and I were talking about like if I didn't go into architecture, I'm not sure if I'd ever talked to an architect in my entire life, ever.
I
Probably
just
not.
went to a wedding. I think it was about 200 people, and a lot of people were coming up to me like, "You're the first architect I've met." And I was like, "This is a really crazy number." Like,
Yeah, and buildings are everywhere. Like everywhere.
You should
So
capitalize on that.
yeah. It's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
But yeah, I think this conversation can go on much further. And
Yeah.
I something that Robbie and I were talking about is like we're trying to figure out like ways of, you know, inviting our viewers to engage in the conversation in some ways. And so I guess like the question that we'd like to ask the audience this time around is, you know, like I guess what are the experiences that you think you've had in your day-to-day life that have either barred you from your ability to access community or ideas or people that you wanted access to, or have encouraged it? Like what does it look like for you? Because I think for me, like the easiest like example for me in my life has been like when I lived in Ghana and, you know, we had like a courtyard house. That was like, that's like, I think for me, that's like the clear image of it for me, but you know, it might look like something else for someone else, because I think that's not the only way it can happen. So hopefully people can engage in that in the comments and, you know, disagree with us. Like if you think we are looking at things differently that we should be, or we didn't mention something, please do. Like we're really interested to hear. With that, like, I guess any last thoughts from everybody.
No, that's not the question we asked. What do you want the audience to take away from the conversation?
You know what I mean.
No, you don't. Alex's first episode with us.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I guess in respect to Alex, yeah, my bad. Yeah. So that is the question we typically ask is what is yeah, I guess what's the takeaway for the audience? So Alex, go ahead. Just kidding.
So, the question is to me on what is the takeaway?
To everyone, like we're all
Yeah,
gonna say what we want people to take away from this conversation. I can start. It's not necessarily well articulated, which is most things I say, but okay. I think what I want the audience to take away is that yes, you're part of a community, but I hope you do your part. There's people around you who may be feeling as lonely as you are or are in need of connection. Everyone wants it. So try to do your part in trying to get it. And I do know that we're doing a good job in just trying to make more of a community now. And I hope we eventually get there. Yeah.
Okay.
And to designers, create more space for communities, because really context is people. And if you're not catering to people, what are you doing? Yeah.
So I'd say on my end, a key takeaway for the audience would be just diving into things that you're curious about, right? And you'll find that the thing you naturally gravitate towards, whether that is music or volunteering for an environmental cause, or just joining, a club, like a group, that will open up doors to so many other things that you wouldn't even have imagined, right? That your life could be or could have. And it comes down to those communities. And we have a mosaic of communities, and we have to see that as well, right? It's not just one, but there's many, because we are very multifaceted. And it's, I would say, about embracing that. And yeah.
Yeah, I guess for me, I think we all need to be critical of like the games that are played with us a little bit. I think buzzwords are such a dangerous thing, right? Like we talk about inclusivity, diversity, even in the climate change conversation, like words are used to distract us from things that people aren't doing constantly. And I think we don't need to be satisfied with that. I'm not sure to what degree this can happen, but I think, that somehow there has to be like the awareness that like the actions that are not happening, right, versus the words that are being told us to us, like those are things that are slowly stripping things away from us. And we're not seeing it till it's a little too late. And like, yeah, like it's a daunting question. I get that. And I can't say I've found ways to do that myself in, as a civilian, I guess. But yeah, I think that's like a question that like really sits with me, is like, okay, if these are the things I stand for or want to see more of, like how do I actually enact those things? And I think Robbie's getting to that a little bit, where it's like, like for me, moving out of my apartment recently, I needed like some wrenches to take apart the sculpture that wouldn't fit in my car. And I was like, oh, let me drive to the hardware store. And I was like, wait, there's literally like someone renovating an apartment down the hall. Like, why don't I just go ask them? And I remember having a bit of anxiety about it, because I'm like, wow, what if I'm being a bother? But they're more than happy to help. So I think at least in those very small ways, like, if we have that attitude towards one another, we can at least like foster that. But again, I think that's like in place to the real question of like, what are the things that our spaces can do to help us, right? Like we shouldn't be having to, jump through these hoops to make these things happen for ourselves. Yeah, so slightly somber, but that's what's on my mind, I guess.
Yeah, I guess slightly tying into that is like making use of the community. Like it's for you. It's for helping you move your stuff, or it's for a meanwhile use. It's not something that's there because it was designed to be for, but sometimes these things, they come about more naturally. And when they do, make full advantage of it. Like that is the biggest asset in your community.
Right. Thank you guys so much for those
Yeah.
great takeaways.
Yeah. And I will do my thing and say goodbye to the audience. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone, and to your grandmother's
And
room.
please like and subscribe.
Yes,
The button is
and
right there. Come on, do it.
Please.
Thank you.
and engage with this, and also, just hug someone you love today, because we had a conversation about community, and you better do that.
Yeah, say hi to that grandma that lives in the apartment below you. She'll
No,
love
don't do that. She could be a serial killer. Because I don't know.
it.
Okay. Goodbye,
Don't go inside
everyone.
the house. But yeah. Right. Later, guys. Thank you for coming.
Bye.